Chapter 2. Spyalarak Sibir Nochair, Stranglers of the Dragon's Necks. At the chamber of larkspurs in the Imperial Palace. "So our prospects look grim," murmured the Empress upon her throne. "Unfortunately," concurred the military command director Faramunch. A planar space map was situated before them. The Empire's combat lines were collapsing as they spoke. The Empire's forces seemed superior overall, but the enemy tore through the places they were spread thin. Things were especially dire for the Cryab monarchy. The territory surrounded by the Hania Federation was being encroached on from all sides by a fleet whose core was composed of the peacekeepers. Fleets from Greater Alcant had been detected as well. One could only assume the third nation of the Three Nations Alliance, the Peace SU, was involved as well. And it was possible that the ostensibly neutral Hania Federation, which had been on the cusp of incorporation into the Empire, had added their own military power to the enemy's cause. After all, there were no signs of Hanian ships resisting the enemy. In fact, it looked as though they were cooperating with them. Now that it had come to this, they had no choice but to presume that the peaceful assimilation of Hania had been reneged. In other words, the Brukapoth Bisayan, Three Nations Alliance, was now the Brukapoth Goes Sion. And while under normal circumstances, the OV would celebrate the political map of the cosmos becoming so simple, it couldn't have happened at a worse juncture. "This is difficult to watch," she remarked. "Lamas was once the Larth Cryab, the Queen of Cryab. In the Empire, monarchs did not govern monarchies. They merely managed the portals that linked the imperial capital to those monarchies. It was the Cryab portal that the enemy fleets were aiming for. Their ultimate objective could only be what lay beyond that portal, Lokfakar, the capital of 8 portals and the base of the dragon's necks. And their wish was steadily coming to fruition. Lokfakar was about to test another of its monikers, the Unfelled. One of the issues with planar space was that it took time to relay information. As such, the planar space map operated under a time lag. In all likelihood, the situation was now even worse than presently displayed. The Cryab monarchy had next to no war potential, and the reserve forces were too scant to send in reinforcements. Holding the enemy attackers at bay in a single area was likely all they could reasonably do. And that was akin to plugging up a single hole in a sieve, a pointless endeavor. "How many days until they reached the capital?" asked Lamas. There was absolutely no reason to hold out hope. It was an established fact that Lokfakar had seen the propulsor flames of enemy ships only 4 times before. 7 or so days, we believe," replied Faramunch. "How many can we call back here in that time? In addition to the current troops, we would have 20 subfleets at most. Not nearly enough to defend the capital. If there were the slightest chance they could win, she would bet it all on that chance." But there was 0 chance of victory. "Understood," nodded Lamas. She looked at Faramunch. "We should have followed your counsel." If she had followed his advice, they could have mobilized enough forces to at least muster some hope, even if they still wouldn't have realistically sufficed. If I could laugh and say, "I told you so," I'm sure there would be no greater satisfaction, but for obvious reasons, I don't feel so inclined. Can this incompetent Empress ask you not to abandon her? "With all due respect, Your Majesty," he replied, "that is the first time these ears have heard such a foolish question. If Your Majesty believes I would cast away the privilege of meeting our defeat alongside you, then you are sorely mistaken." "We see." The Empress smiled faintly. "My apologies," said the Chancellor, bowing his head. "It's all the fault of my flawed counsel. We were not blaming you. We do not intend to blame anyone. We were deriding ourselves," she consoled him. "Success and defeat both belong to the decider. The destiny of the Empire is the Emperor's responsibility. Do not steal from us what is ours. You are still the Chancellor of the Empire, but if you plan to repeat your pointless apology, then you are not worthy. I appreciate Your Majesty's kind words." Brosh was an accomplished bureaucrat of the Empire, and he had served alongside Lamas for a lengthy stretch. The Empress asserted it was her responsibility, so he would not bring it up again, if for no other reason than that there was simply no time. "We might want to cede the capital to the enemy for the time being," said Lamas. "Have you any thoughts on the matter?" "I just hope that by experiencing Lokfakar, the enemy might become more culturally refined, Even if only by a little, said Faramunch. Lamas paid the military command director's banter no heed. Prepare the watchguard fleet to sortie. As your majesty decrees, said Faramunch. Chancellor, have you any thoughts? At present, I will simply act in accordance with your majesty's will. Brosh's expression was stern and stone-like. Is that so? Lama stood up and signed her hand seal. We invoke the Bethoth Laika So Sabina, Type 3 emergency convocation. The Empress would now receive a large number of bureaucrat and soldier assistants. The convocation was at hand. Faramunch and Brosh were both at the audience, with the Empress in hologram form. Both had heaps of work to do. They were humbling themselves before the Empress, while they were hastily going about their work behind the scenes. The military command director in particular was swamped with preparing the watchguard fleet for departure. The commander-in-chief of the watchguard fleet was the Empress herself, and its chief of staff was the command director himself. The Empress was aware of this, but did not rebuke him for it. In fact, she would have been furious if he had wasted valuable time on nothing but a conversation with the Empress during such a crisis. All she asked of the other people whom she'd called was for them to attend as holograms. Is the Flemishiak Arakar, capital relocation planner, in attendance, called Lamas? Here, your majesty. A man with the Grim Reaper's mien stepped forward and expressed his reverence. The capital relocation planner was a bureaucrat directly under the Empress. As he was the man the Empire least wanted to do his job, this was his first time coming to the fore. The practical reason was that moving a portal was no easy task. But more to the point, the Ov loved Lokvakar. For the majority of Ovs, the imperial capital was their birthplace and home. But there was a time when relocation could not be avoided, and that time was the impending fall of Lokvakar. The Ov had existed alongside their empire for far too long. They wouldn't let a little thing like the fall of the imperial capital cause them to leave the empire to crumble. Though the relocation planner was seldom in the limelight, his everyday work life was a busy one. The first problem to solve was where to relocate to. In times of peace, the empire's territory was stable, but not so in times of war. The number of territory nations in each monarchy and their respective industrial outputs and centers were in flux. Even more changeable was their manpower. Fleet placement shifted at dizzying rates in response to the tides of war, and their human resources moved along with them. Fleet equipment could be set up relatively quickly thanks to mobile construction sites, but soldiers were a different story. The monarchy with the current largest number of soldiers was the number one candidate. Of course, they'd need a well-maintained fleet to survive the time of crisis following the capital's fall. They would have to first choose which of the GA FASEC, 8 monarchies, had the best logistics and war potential to continue the struggle, and then which star system in that monarchy would be most suited to the new capital. There were more than a few facilities that only existed in Lokvakar, and chief among them were the warship construction sites. The hulls of ships could be built outside of the capital, but only the 5 great construction sites could manufacture space-time bubble generators. In the event of a capital relocation, the warship construction sites would be disassembled and fitted with bubble generators for evacuation purposes. This was where they had a difficult choice to make. Should they concentrate all the facilities in the monarchy with the new capital, or should they station them in other monarchies too? Concentrating their war potential would increase their overall chances of prevailing in the end, but it would also mean forsaking the other territories. Fortunately for whoever occupied the position of relocation planner, it was not for them to make that choice. The Empress was there to pick her poison. The current capital relocation planner was named Suzriak Borg Gocher Sotek, and he was a landworlder. He only appeared before the Empress once a year in order to report how the plan stood at that time. Up until now, it was a largely ceremonial gesture meant to demonstrate he was doing his job. But this time it was the real deal, and he was clearly nervous. He never expected the day would come during his tenure in office. He had many subordinates, the most important of which were the 3 Roy Flemishiak Arakar, deputy capital relocation planners. They hadn't reported to the chamber, not even via hologram, but they were where their superior was physically. Tell us where the interim capital shall be, commanded the Empress. We believe the Timex Satrior Astrobase, of the Barca monarchy to be the most suitable, your majesty, said Suzriua. We see, nodded Llamas. She looked at Faramunch's hologram. Ideally, we would fight to preserve the capital, but you say that is impossible. As much as it pains me to admit it. Then will our second best option come to fruition? By second best option, she of course meant defending the Orocha Sila, temporary capital. Might it be too close? Each of the 8 monarchies possessed an astrobase. While there were exceptions, the portal to the astrobase was typically quite close to the portal to the capital, and that was true for the Barca monarchy as well. The Sod Satrior portal, was very close indeed to the Barca portal, which led to Lokvakar. That proximity made it that much easier to evacuate, but it also made it easier for the enemy to attack both the capital and Barca. They might raid the temporary capital with the same momentum with which they charged through the original capital. If they lost the temporary capital as well, it would spell the end of the empire. It will be quite possible for us to mount Satrior's defense, said Faramunch. His tone had a somebody-else problem quality to it, and that was because defending the temporary capital wasn't his job. He just knew that the decision must have been made on some grounds, so he knew deciding it was capable of being defended wasn't merely some slapdash stopgap measure. Understood. She nodded again and returned her gaze to Sazriwa. Set about preparing to relocate the capital at once. Shall we concentrate them? He was of course asking whether they were going to abandon the territories not connected to the Barca monarchy. The Barca and Wesco monarchies were adjacent to each other via planar space since before the war. Though they were divided into 2 separate monarchies by the vagaries of history, their connection had lasted for a long time, making for the empire's most robust sphere of influence. Since Operation Twin Thorns had progressed smoothly, they could also contact the Syawarjidi monarchy. And Operations Phantom Flame and Hunter successfully brought together the Syawarjidi and Razius monarchies. While there were still land worlds in the former territory stretching between the 2 monarchies, the relevant planar space was in the Empire's hands. This would, however, end up isolating the Skir, Elish, Bargzada, and Kryab monarchies. Elish and Kryab were already as good as lost. Going off the war potential left to them, they would certainly be overrun by the enemy before the crest of the 8-headed dragon could shine in the capital once more. When it came to Skir and Bargzada, on the other hand, they might be able to re-establish contact with them at a relatively early stage. If they didn't concentrate their war potential and production capacity, and instead distributed it, it would be a huge boon to the people left behind. Llamas closed her eyes, and none could blame her. She ruminated for a few seconds. Concentrate our force of arms. Faramunch had said defending the temporary capital was possible. However, that was not a guarantee it was absolutely safe, and as such, it was incumbent on her to improve their chances however she could. Splitting up their forces would lower their odds. As your majesty decrees. But Llamas hadn't decided to forsake half of the empire either. Is it possible to send the space-time bubble generator manufacturing lines to Skir and Bargzada? Setting aside the sad cases of Elish and Kryab, she wanted to leave their bubble generator manufacturing capacity to Skir and Bargzada. That way, they would gain the ability to maintain their own war potential by their own power. Unfortunately, this was easier said than done. If we simply send them over, then yes, we are able. Now if your majesty would kindly look at this data concerning that policy's impact. Numbers and diagrams floated up before the Jade Throne. They displayed the difference between 2 scenarios, one where they concentrated the bubble generator manufacturing facilities in the temporary capital, and one where they transferred portions of them to the other monarchies. Naturally, she knew that splitting up the facilities would cut down on their productivity, but the sheer drop in yields exceeded the Empress's expectations. Can you display what would happen if we transferred them all over to a single place? Why, of course, your majesty. Sazriwa looked wounded. I will display them now. Different numbers, different diagrams. Now the gap was within acceptable levels. Send them to the Skir monarchy, she commanded. Faramunch. Yes, your majesty, said the military command director. Instruct the troops that cannot reach the temporary capital to head for Skir. It shall be done. Of course, it would be exceedingly difficult to get in touch with the troops that were left behind thanks to this situation. Many troops were outright impossible to send orders to, but both Llamas and Faramunch understood that already. They could only hope each commanding officer would select the correct direction to retreat to. Though even if they did, there was no guarantee they would be able to advance along that correct path. If you would excuse me, I will head for Satrior right away. Suzrua bowed. Is that part of the arrangements? Yes, Your Majesty. I will leave my deputies here in the capital. One of the deputies appeared via hologram and bowed profoundly to the Empress. Your Majesty, I am Almroy Flamisiak Arakar, Chief Deputy Capital Relocation Planner, FESFA. May I be allowed to lead operations in the capital? You may lead them. I am most grateful, said FESFA. Now then, Your Majesty, said Suzrua, we must part for a brief while. It is my wish that I return to the capital with the luxury of lamenting that all my work was in vain. Lamas was about to reply when Command Director Farah Munch's hologram moved. Your Majesty. Before Suzrua's eyes, Farah Munch bowed his head toward the throne. That was fast. Have the preparations for the Watchguard fleet sortie already been made? I have unrelated news to report. We will not hear any news unless it's good news, she joked. Then I have no news that needs reporting, said the director. Relocation Planner, smiled Lamans forlornly. We were also looking forward to the day you came here to lament, but it seems that day will not come. Suzrua bowed silently. The Empress braced for impact. State your news, Command Director. It appears the Timex Sembri of Astrobase, has fallen. That Astrobase was in the Cryab monarchy, and the Sod Sembri of Portal, was close to the entryway to the capital even compared to other Sod Chitmer, Astrobase portals. The enemy would flood the Cryab portal shortly. They had precious little time left. We plan to proclaim the order to prepare for the emergency capital relocation in 6 hours' time. The Empress scanned the high-ranking officials packed in the chamber. Any objections? The relocation would be an enormous undertaking, even if it came in the form of an emergency evacuation. After all, this was the first time it had happened in the history of the Empire. Preparing for an undertaking of that magnitude could not realistically be done under the veil of secrecy. Hamstringing the people making those preparations by making them act in secrecy would be putting the cart before the horse. Almost everyone in the capital had some sort of mission related to the relocation. The exceptions were infants and the seriously ill or unconscious. In fact, even infants were expected to execute their mission, which was being on their best behavior. Confusion was inevitable, as people were required to abandon whatever they were engaged in until then and take up an entirely new mission. In order to minimize that confusion, there needed to be a preparatory stage for the preparatory stage, and that entailed telling only a select few. The courtiers bowed their heads. Each was one of those select few. We shall name the emergency relocation operation Kvizatek Semroner, Operation Phoenix, decreed the Empress. A fine name, Your Majesty, said Faramunch. I regret I cannot take charge of the Bior Semroner, Phoenix fleet. We see. The Empress nodded approvingly. King of Barca, she called. Here, Your Majesty. The hologram of the Crown Prince cum Imperial Fleet Commander-in-Chief cum Twin Thorns Fleet Commander-in-Chief, King of Barca Avrielsek, ne Lamsar du Sanyu, appeared. He was currently on the Imperial Fleet flagship, the Sonkau. More than 2/3 of the Star Forces' force of arms was under his command, but almost all of it was tied up in the front lines, and carrycrafts were about all the Crown Prince had at hand apart from the troops that just happened to have returned to the capital. Listening, were you? Dusanyu had already been there by the time Faramunch and Lamans entered the palace. He probably hadn't appeared holographically because he simply didn't have anything to say. Yes. The Sonkau is already on a course for the Barca portal. Thoroughly prepared, as usual, smiled Lamas. Then we have nothing to tell you. The enemy will spring forth from the portal that our family controls, and you must drop subjects from your family's portal. We know that you would love to entertain me by thinking up silly witticisms, but we're afraid we haven't the time to lend an ear to them. Now organize the Phoenix fleet and devote your energies to your duties. As Your Majesty decrees, said Dusanyu. I intend to be back as soon as possible to sully your ears with my silly witticisms, so until then, I trust Your Majesty will not damage my throne or the Imperial command baton. The hologram vanished. Always with the unreasonable demands, murmured Lamas. But she was not dissatisfied. She seemed more amused than anything else. Then she stood from the throne. Nisif Glaherer Soberlach Arakr, Your Eminence, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Capital Defense Platoon, she said, bowing her head deferentially to a servant vassal. Please convene the Soberlach Arakr as soon as the preparation decree is handed down. She looked up and saw the 8 abdicant emperors there. As your majesty wishes, nodded Dusumek, the abdicant with light purple hair. The Imperial Capital Defense Platoon was made up mostly of retired soldiers, and its commanding officer was chosen from among the abdicants. Its current commander-in-chief was the oldest of the current abdicants, Dusumek. Under normal circumstances, the Capital Defense Platoon was that in name only. Maintaining and inspecting the equipment were essential, and they sometimes even remembered to train. But the young saw it more as an organization for retirees to have friendly get-togethers and hold lots of banquets. But the defense platoon was formed precisely for times like these. Though defense was in the name, that was not necessarily what was expected of it. As a scraped-together corps, the defense platoon could not be expected to repel enemies that the actual war fleets failed to keep at bay. At least when it came to combat, the OV were extremely pragmatic. Their real task was to delay the capital's fall as much as possible and buy them time to evacuate. Since the members of the platoon were required to die in the capital, only applicants and volunteers were generally registered in its rolls, but retired abdicants and nobles were duty-bound to serve. Consequently, all of the abdicants belonged to the defense platoon, not just Dusumek. The OV were unaging. When they were near death, they started falling asleep for longer and longer periods of time, but until then they remained as fit and healthy as ever. There was a reason it was said guessing the age of an OV past 40 was an insurmountable task. Imperials retired not due to physical fatigue, but because society demanded it. When the highest echelon got stagnant, it caused the whole structure to ossify. In this case, that structure was the star forces, and an overly rigid star forces was a cause for alarm in the eyes of the whole empire. In other words, the retired imperial skills were not inferior to those of the soldiers in active duty. What they lacked in recent training, they made up for with their wealth of experience. And the empire couldn't afford not to make use of the platoon during a crisis like this. The convocation of the defense platoon would clue a great number of souls into the capital's imminent abandonment to these old stalwarts. The race of blue hair and spatiosensory organs had what were called fate genes. These fate genes were designed to force the OV to prioritize the population over their individual lives, and they were what allowed the OV to give up their lives without hesitation for the good of the whole race. If something was believed to be indispensable for their race to persist, the OV would protect it with their lives. And the vast majority of OVs believed the empire to be necessary for their race's survival. 6 hours after Lamas secretly ordered the commencement of Operation Phoenix, the decree to prepare for emergency capital relocation was issued, just as scheduled. Suddenly, the capital was swept in a hectic flurry of activity. The only facilities that could manufacture space-time bubble generators were the 5 great construction sites, all of which were in Lokvakar, Lesbo, Better, Sire, Gokrosh, and Babanot. It was these bubble generators that made the empire an interstellar power. Concentrating the manufacturing facilities in the capital was an effective tactic to prevent the nightmare of a fractured empire. The trade-off was the inherent and extreme strategic danger. If they lost the capital and the construction sites with it, they would no longer be able to produce new interstellar ships of any kind, and the empire would lose any power to continue prosecuting this war. Even if by some miracle the enemy stopped fighting at the capital's capture, the empire would still inevitably dissolve into its constituent star systems. As such, the construction sites were designed to be movable. They could be disassembled, and the portions that could be called their cores came equipped with bubble generators and propulsion systems of their own. Put simply, they could instantly become de facto interstellar ships. On the orders of the Director of Imperial Warship Management Headquarters, the construction site's junctions were detonated, but only after 2 hours to enable the construction personnel to evacuate. The construction sites were mini-cities of a stripe. The workers there, including the site chiefs, lived with their families in the site's residential areas. They, of course, had to evacuate along with the site's cores. They could even be called the site's true cores themselves. As long as they and the technical information were still around, the sites could eventually be rebuilt whether or not the Empire lost them all. Yet if the personnel died or fell into enemy hands, then even unscathed sites would become useless. The personnel boarded dozens of caragraphs and swiftly escaped from the capital. They were only allowed to take minimal amounts of their personal belongings with them. In addition, if the war was looking neither great nor hopeless, they would have the majority of their household goods sent to them later. If the war was going well, they could simply return to the capital in short order, and if it was going poorly, the capital would fall before their things could be sent over. Meanwhile, the families of personnel were a higher priority to save, but they would also be evacuating the capital sometime later. Avs by birth were relatively accustomed to their families being scattered, but the same could not be said for many landworlders, and pulling landworlder personnel apart from their families and stuffing them into caragraphs did cause some scenes. There was one exception to the no-family rule, and that was small children who didn't have guardians apart from the prioritized evacuees. They were pre-registered and boarded the same ships as the construction site personnel. Though the citizenry of the UH would scarcely believe it, the OV did have the concept of humaneness. That being said, this did leave a bitter aftertaste. As OV society had no system of marriage, a family was classified as a combination of one or more adults and one or more children that could not be left without a guardian. Therefore, the OVs by birth were able to be accompanied by their whole families. In the eyes of the landworlders, this came across as discrimination, but that was just a misunderstanding. Whether one would be separated from their family was determined not by one's societal status, but by their personal position. On that day, there were many separations in Lokvakar, and all were susceptible depending on their posts, no matter how high their rank or status. Not even Imperials were exempt.